If you've ever wanted to pretend to be a cop and ensure that everyone else in traffic hates you, you're in luck, because today we are taking a look at the 2011 Ford Explorer and we're going to decide if it's a buy or if it's a bust. That's right, for this high miles review, we are going to take an in-depth look at the 2011 Explorer. Behind me, it has 180,000 miles on it. Ford completely redesigned these cars for 2011. It was the biggest change they had ever made to the Explorer name. We're going to decide if it's held up well over the past 13 years. We're going to go over the good, the bad, the ugly on this Explorer. Up front here, we can see that the paint is shining nicely. As far as style, I think these are okay. They were a huge departure from the previous Explorer. Like I said, they used to be more of a full-size SUV that was on the truck frame like the Tahoe and the Suburban were from Chevy. And this is a unibody, which just means it's basically built more like a car and should, in theory, drive a little bit more refined because of it. Moving back the side here, we are in the Northeast, and there is not a lot of rust to speak of on these cars. They've held up pretty well overall. Still would check them out if you're in the Salt Belt, but this one is in pretty nice shape considering the age and miles. I really have no big complaints on the outside of this car at all. The wheels have held up well, the paint, the chrome, all of it looks really, really nice. The only place that I did see some paint damage is just the clear coat up along this roof here. Now that probably will get worse over time. Other than that paint, I really do not have a lot of remarks on the outside. The headlights look good. Everything has held up quite well. Now for this redesigned Explorer, Ford only offered one engine option this first year. This is before the EcoBoost came out in later models, but it is a 3.5 liter V6. Now this engine is rated at 290 horsepower, 250 pound-feet of torque, and mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission. Those numbers are actually pretty respectable even today, so Ford did a pretty good job on the power side of things. We'll check that out a little bit more on the test drive. Now, I always like to talk how I feel about the engine specifically on vehicles, and this one's okay. It falls into the category of I don't love it, I don't hate it. It does have a few things that really need to be paid attention to, unfortunately, to get the most life out of them. This specific car has actually been quite reliable. It does have a check engine light on for coil packs, which is somewhat common. It really doesn't create a ton of problems other than under heavy acceleration, it'll just miss a little bit. But here are the things that you got to look out for if you're looking at a used one of these cars. And we're just going to start off with the biggest one, and then we'll move on to some of the smaller items. The big one is water pump / timing chain related issues. The big problem with looking at one of these when they are up to higher mileage is generally the water pump is your first failure. The water pump is connected in with your timing chain and everything on the side of the engine. If you're not familiar with this, basically, they got to tear the whole side of the engine off to get to these things, and it's a fairly involved process that's going to charge somewhere around $2,000 to $3,000 if you have it done at a shop. The telltale sign that you have a problem with your water pump is you look at your oil and you will see that the oil looks very milky. It should just be black or gold and kind of clear, unless you haven't changed it in a while, but it should not ever look milky. Basically, the water pump fails and the coolant will mix with your oil and can destroy your engine if you do not catch it in time. It's happened to a lot of these cars. And unfortunately, like some vehicles, you can't just replace the water pump itself. I guess in theory you could, but you still have to reset all the timing and do all of the other work. So you would end up doing a new timing set, water pump, basically everything on the side of the engine. And that is where you end up having so much expense put into it. Ford rated those water pumps to last like 250,000 miles, I believe. I think that's a little bit high based on the experience I've seen, but that probably is largely because people didn't take great care of them. So if I was looking at one of these with 180,000 miles, I know that I have at best a $3,000 bill coming at 250,000 miles, and it might be much before that. So that would be my number one question if I was looking at a used one of these is, has the water pump and timing stuff been done? And if it hasn't, I got to prepare for that expense. Now on to some of the smaller problems. One of the more common ones is intake manifolds cracking. That will cause a coolant leak as well. It's not a terrible expense. I'm not overly concerned about those, but it is something you want to be aware of. Generally, check engine lights are evap related, usually like the purge solenoid. If you're not familiar with them, it's not terribly expensive, not terribly hard to replace. The other one is throttle bodies tend to fail on these as well and cause a check engine light and a few other rough riding problems, things like that. They're a little bit more expensive, but also not terrible and not something that would keep me from buying the car. Other things under here I should mention are transmissions are generally reliable. I would still always take a vehicle on a test drive, get on it really hard to make sure that it shifts good throughout all the gears. It's fine once it's warmed up, all of those things, but they're generally okay, as well as the all-wheel drive system is pretty reliable in these as well. Moving on to interior wear, I really only noticed one thing that I could say was true wear, and that is this driver's seat is showing more wear than is kind of typical. Even at this higher age and mileage, it's not terrible. There's no rips or tears, but it is a significant amount of wear on the side of those bolsters. The rest of the interior in here, I actually really like. Now, you're not going to confuse this for a luxury vehicle really by any stretch, but everything you touch pretty much is soft. The dash is worn well, the door panels have worn well. I really don't have a lot of issues inside here. The center console, I noticed the one storage door is broken, not a big deal. That's kind of across lots of manufacturers, things like that happening. But overall, I was really impressed with this interior. And while this is not a comparison video by any stretch, I just reviewed a Toyota Highlander that was actually a few years newer, and this interior is so much better than the Toyota Highlander was. Really up front in here, when I'm sitting, I have no issues. It's not perfect. I noticed that like the windows are a little clunky, like you can tell that they've gotten loose over time and things like that. But it's really a pretty nice place to be. The seats are comfortable. The foam is worn okay. It's maybe a little bit broken down, but I'm a pretty big fan of how Ford designed these on the inside. The electronics are generally reliable. My switches work. The windows do go up and down. The locks work. The infotainment system in here use the Microsoft Sync, which is outdated. That being said, I think the tech in here is pretty good. You got screens on both sides of your gauge cluster. The resolution is great for all of them. Everything kind of functions better than you would expect in a vehicle of this age. Now, at this point with where technology is, I almost prefer just like a simple radio rather than these old navigation screens, but this is still holding up pretty well considering it's 13 years old. One thing that has failed that I didn't mention yet is the rear camera does not function. That's a pretty common issue on Fords as well. The other important electronic thing is the rear wiper motor has a tendency to fail. And one of the big complaints with these is letting exhaust fumes in. The bodies are just not sealed up properly and can let exhaust fumes in. I haven't noticed it too much with this one, but that was a big problem originally. And while this specific vehicle does not have a sunroof, the ones that do have a typical across all manufacturers problem, and that is the sunroofs tend to leak and can get your interior all moldy, cause you lots of electronic issues. Thankfully, this one doesn't have one. If you do have one or are looking at one with the sunroof, keep those drains clear and make sure that it's sealing up tightly. In the back seat here, and there's a few things that I noticed right away. One, the headroom is great. Tons of it. If you have a long torso, you're going to be good. I'm only 5'8", but I still got plenty. I could be 6'1", and it would be not a problem as far as headroom. Legroom is not quite as good. This seat is where I would sit, and I'm not incredibly tall. And while there is space, I would be just fine if you had a tall person up front and a tall person in the back. It would be difficult. And the third thing that I noticed is this seat is very comfortable. This is actually one of the most comfortable rear seats that I've sat in. It is soft. It fits sort of to your body, more like a front seat or something. And I'm pretty impressed with the comfort level overall. I could do a road trip in here with no problem. And back here, one of the biggest pluses that every manufacturer needs to do, and very few do, is it has a household 110 regular plug outlet already ready to go. You also got climate control, all of that stuff. This is a really nice back seat. I have no complaints other than if you had super tall people, it would be a little tight. Now in the far back, and I would say it's okay. The seat itself is comfortable. It is tight for your feet to sit, all of those things that are typical of a third row. And there is only 2 seats back here, not 3. I would not love it for a long road trip, but it's okay. It's if you had kids or something, I think it would be just fine for them to sit back here for a while. All right, here we go, out on the road in the 2011 Ford Explorer. Now, there is some suspension stuff that we got to go over on these, but first, let's have some fun. We're going to do a little pull and let that 290 horsepower work. Okay, it's okay. It's not a ton of horsepower. I can feel a little bit of stumbling from that coil pack issue with the check engine that I talked about. That's you can just feel a little bit of inconsistency in the acceleration, but overall, power's fine. I would consider it to be average. Now, there's a few little clunks in the suspension, as you'd expect at this amount of mileage. One of the big things that fails on these is the rear toe links go bad. They are probably not terribly expensive or anything like that, but they do wear out and fail more often than they should. Now, probably the #1 failure issue on these cars that I haven't talked about yet is the power steering rack. Power steering racks on these tend to go bad. Ford had a problem with a bunch of their vehicles with power steering racks going bad, and this one is no exception. And it is a fairly expensive bill if you take it to a shop to be done. One of the things that I would consider to be a positive for these is the fuel mileage. Fuel mileage for this large of an SUV is rated at 17 and 25 miles per gallon on the highway. I think that's a pretty good number. It's not out of this world, but it would still be even respectable today for a 7-seater in what is considered to be a full-size SUV. So I got no problems with the fuel mileage at all. The more I'm driving this around now, one of the things that I notice is it is large inside. Like, I feel like I am in a big, cavern, which I personally like. Maybe some people don't, but it feels very spacious. Feels like you would be comfortable on a long-haul drive. The steering, everything like that actually feels pretty good. I think it drives, for this size of an SUV, very, very good. Yeah, I am impressed with the overall driving experience. Anything like this, when you get up to this mileage, you're going to be into struts and ball joints, tie rod ends, things like that. And I do, like I said, I hear some of those clunks that need to be addressed, but nothing that would keep me in the driving experience from buying the car. I think it works pretty well. Back from the road test, and now we are going to decide if this is a buy or if it's a bust. This is a little bit of a difficult one for me because I think this Explorer offers a lot for the money and the value of it. Overall, I think the reliability is probably not as good as Honda and Toyota. I think they're pretty much run-of-the-mill with everyone else, or even a little bit better. I also think that if you're prepared to do the timing and the water pump stuff, which I consider to be the biggest cause for concern, I think you're good to go. Or if those repairs have already been done, you're pretty well set. But it is something you have to be aware of if you're buying one with over 150,000 miles. Price on these runs somewhere around $6,000, which, as I already mentioned, I think you get a lot of vehicle for the money. I like the interior on these better than a lot of the competition. I think the driving experience is comparable or better than a lot of the competition. And overall, I think I was just more impressed with this car than I thought that I would be. That's why today I am going to make this car a thin line buy. It really could go either way. There is more common problems than I usually like to say with a buy, but I also can't ignore the value on these cars, and if they're kept up with, can be pretty decently reliable. Now, Ford made lots of changes throughout the years and put different engines and things in, so those might be a different answer. If you have a Ford Explorer and have had a negative experience, a great experience, I want to hear about it. Put those comments down below. Let me know what problems you've had. If you've had some of the same problems that I mentioned here today, I would love to just hear your thoughts on these cars. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Have a great day.
Yeah. Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good, fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts, I pop off when I hear people say I cannot. I get off to the thought of proving everyone wrong, I won't stop to the top, so